Another very interesting study was published from the University of Miami in 1986, I believe, in the journal Pediatrics, where a group of investigators were studying premature infants and their ability to thrive. In medical language, premature infants are called preemies. So they had two groups of preemies. One they called the control group and one they called the experimental group. The only difference between the control group and the experimental group was that in the experimental group, the cribs had little holes in them, and through the holes, an investigator could reach in and he could stroke them 3 times a day for about 5 minutes each. Of course, they didn't call it stroking, they called it tactile kinesthetic stimulation, which is the Orwellian term for stroking. God forbid call it love. But in any case, those children who received tactile kinesthetic stimulation for 5 minutes, 3 times a day, gained an average of 49% more weight per day. Almost 50% weight gain more than the control group per day, leading the investigators to conclude that tactile kinesthetic stimulation is a cost-effective strategy because it can save $3,000 per admission. You can discharge the babies 5 days earlier. So believe it or not, now Blue Cross Blue Shield is making up a code for tactile kinesthetic stimulation, can be covered by insurance. What's happening in all these instances? The flow of consciousness is causing some matter to appear. In this case, the experience of love, translated, it was subsequently found, into very specific molecules called growth factors and growth hormones. In fact, those children who were stroked were secreting about 5 to 10 times more growth factor, growth hormone, in their bodies, in their brain cells, but in all the cells of their bodies. There's a condition in children called psychosocial dwarfism, where children don't grow. They're brought up in orphanages, and you can give them good food and do everything you want, they still don't grow. And of course, if you're still entrenched in the superstition of materialism, you say, well, let me see what's happening, and you find that their growth hormone levels are very depressed. So you say, fine, I'll give them growth hormone injections. You give them growth hormones, they still don't grow because the receptors refuse to accept the growth hormone. You take that child out of an orphanage, put it in a loving environment where there's somebody who can stroke them, they can call somebody mother, and suddenly the growth hormone levels go up. Not only do the growth hormone levels go up, the receptors start soaking them up and the children start growing. Again, the flow of consciousness resulting in very distinct material expression. Very distinct material expression. So we are seeing here, in fact, another model emerging. That void of empty space is not an emptiness of nothing. That void of empty space is a fullness of consciousness. By consciousness, we mean an intelligence that interacts with its own self and then produces, conceives, constructs, governs, and actually becomes matter. So the expression being, becoming, being becomes, because that emptiness is a fullness of that non-material intelligence that is translating itself into the physiology and ultimately even the anatomy of our bodies. About a few years ago, I'll just mention a couple more studies because they're so to me as a scientist. The HEW, which is the Health Education Welfare Department in Massachusetts, looked once again at the risk factors for heart disease. And you'd say, why did they look at risk factors for heart disease? We know what they are: smoking and hypertension and high cholesterol and family history, etc. Well, the reason they looked at the risk factors for heart disease is that the majority of people who get heart attacks today do not have any of the usual standard risk factors. Did you know that the majority of people who have heart attacks today do not have the standard usual risk factors? So the HEW decided to look at it once again, and they found that the number one risk factor was what is called self-happiness rating. The number 2 risk factor was job dissatisfaction. It meant you could go on the street and you could ask people 2 questions. Number 1, are you happy? And number 2, do you love what you're doing? And if they could honestly say yes to both, then they were going to be okay. In India, we would say, are you in dharma? Have you found your place in the universe? Do you know what your purpose here in life is? These are the 2 most frequently cited and important risk factors. It turns out, not only for heart disease, but it turns out for other diseases as well. In fact, a very astonishing statistic came out of these studies. It seems more people die in our culture today on one particular day of the week, and I'm sure you can guess which one that is. Monday. Guess what time? 9 o'clock on Monday morning, more people die in our civilization than any other time of the week. It's an extraordinary and stunning and unique accomplishment for which only the human species can take credit. Presumably, no other animal knows the difference between Monday and Tuesday. What's the difference? It's an idea. It's a notion. Just a faint interpretation somewhere in the mind. And that's what the body is. When you experience tranquility, you have made an interpretation of a sensory experience as tranquil. And your body starts making Valium. And the Valium is not made just in the brain cells, it's made in all the cells of the body. The heart makes it, the immune cells make it, everywhere. And this Valium is secreted in very precise amounts, so you don't feel like a zombie. In fact, this is the molecular equivalent of tranquility. Even cells, leukocytes, red cells, they're all making this Valium, which is helping them do their job in tranquility. On the other hand, if you're feeling jittery, which is another interpretation of a sensory experience, then the body doesn't make Valium. It starts making jittery molecules called adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, cortisol, etc., which have an adverse effect on the immune system. If you feel exhilarated, and that's another interpretation of another sensory experience, then the body makes interleukins, interferons. These are very powerful immunomodulators or anti-cancer drugs. Recently, interleukin-2 was used for the treatment of melanoma, which is a devastating skin cancer, was also used in the treatment of kidney cancer, and in fact it was very effective. Very, very effective. 80% of the cases, the tumors can be cured altogether. The only problem is, as it's now available, it's quite toxic. That's number 1. And number 2, it's very expensive. A full course of interleukin can cost up to $40,000. But you take a ride on Magic Mountain in Disney World, you can make millions of dollars worth of interleukin-2, provided your interpretation of that experience is, this is fun. It's not the joyride. It's not the joyride, interpretation. That's the point. And who makes the interpretation? Where is that person who makes the interpretation? Can we localize it? We'll see we can't localize that. It's non-local. By non-local, I mean that person who makes the interpretation, we seem to think exists somewhere here, but in fact he's not only somewhere here, he, she, it, he's not only somewhere here, he's everywhere all at the same time. Everywhere in my body and everywhere in the universe. That evidence is now beginning to emerge that thoughts are not local phenomena. Thoughts are not local phenomena. You think that your thought is unique to you, that's localized somewhere in the brain. Well, that evidence is now beginning to emerge that that's not the way it really happens. For example, if I have the thought, I am thirsty, which I have now, right now, this thought. As soon as I have this thought, I am thirsty, my brain cells will make a chemical called angiotensin II. It's the molecular equivalent of the notion, I am thirsty. My brain cells will make that. There's another part of my hypothalamus that is part of my brain, will also make angiotensin II. It causes, so in my brain, angiotensin, what does it do? It modifies my behavior in such a way that I start looking for water.